Welcome to another great episode here on IT Pro TV. I'm your host, Ronnie Wong, and we're taking a look at the PMP, the Project Management Professional. And today, with us, Mr. Don Pezet. How's it going?
It is going great, Ronnie. Ready to continue on with our process analysis episode. If you didn't watch the last part, we got a chance to take a look at Six Sigma, Lean, and Kanban, and how they kind of influence how we handle process improvement today. And at the very end of the episode, I said something to the effect of, you don't have to start from scratch on a lot of this. There's a lot of organizations out there that want to help you implement efficient processes from the very beginning and not have to go through a ton of process improvement to make it better. So what we have are basically what PMI boils down to: standards and best practices. All right. So let's say that I'm forming up a new company, or I'm moving into an area that I'm not really familiar with, and I want to make sure that things are running as efficiently as possible. I just need a good starting point, a good place to kind of pick up from and know that I'm in as good a shape as that I can be. And what I can do is I can look out to the world and look out for my industry and say, is there a standards body out there? Or is there a collective of best practices that I can follow to at least put me in the best footing from the very beginning? We can always change, right? But at least get me started in the right place. Well, the first thing we need to understand is the difference between a standard and a best practice, all right? Standards are important. Best practices are even more important. A best practice it's not a law. It's not even a rule, really. It's more of a guideline or a suggestion. And it's usually organizations that deal with a certain kind of equipment. So like in IT, we have wireless access points. And wireless access points can use a number of different frequencies and encryption standards and so on. And so there is the Wi-Fi Alliance, which puts out a collection of best practices that say, if you're going to deploy a wireless network, here's how we recommend you do it. Here's the frequencies we recommend you use. Here's how we recommend you position your access points. Here's how we recommend equipment that we know will be compatible with each other, right? And you can choose to take their advice and follow it, or you can choose to ignore it, disregard it, right? But the idea is that if you don't know anything, you can follow their best practices and you'll end up okay. You might have been able to do a better job if you had the experience, expertise, technique, whatever. But if you didn't know anything, you'll do fine following the best practices, right? You see that with servers, you see it with construction, you see it in medical environments. There's always these best practices. If you don't follow them, what's your penalty? Nothing. Well, you might fail, right? You might fail unnecessarily. Or you might know more than the people who did these best practices. Because when they create a best practice, they're trying to think about everybody. What's the best solution for everybody as a whole, right? And think about that most common, what is it? The
lowest common denominator?
Yes, there we go. Which I usually use in a more sarcastic light, but in this case it actually makes sense. The lowest common denominator, right? What everybody has in common. But you might have things that make you different, and you know that. The best practices organizations don't know that. So you might have a very good reason for moving away from a best practice, and that's perfectly fine. All right? So that's kind of the advantage of a best practice. And there's organizations out there that are packed full of them. A great example would be like the CMMI, right? Let me just bring up their website here, the CMMI Institute. And what these guys do is they basically do, they do a lot of things. They focus on capabilities, though. Your company does something, right? It produces an item or provides a service. Every company does something, unless you're in politics, and then you probably don't do anything. But everybody else, you do something, right? And they help you with what's called a capability maturity model, right? How you can make sure that your capability is being provided in a mature fashion, to use the words in their own definition. And these guys have a ton of best practices and processes, and if you want, you can even pay them. And they'll send consultants out to you to help to make sure that you get the right processes in place from the very beginning, that you can always tweak and improve down the road, but at least here in the beginning, you've got a great starting point and you've got everything that you need. All right? That's an example of best practices, guidelines, suggestions, right? But the alternative is a standard. All right? Now, standards can be the same, right? A standard can be like a guideline, a recommendation. I can choose to follow a standard if I want. But standards actually have a little bit of teeth to them, right? That if I want to be compliant with a standard, right? The government for your country, like here in the United States, we have all sorts of laws and things that are in place that dictate we have to follow certain procedures if we want to do business. And if we don't follow those standards, we're not allowed to do business. That's a lot different than a best practice that we can choose to ignore, right? A great example of a standard would be something like ITIL, right? In England, the United Kingdom, their government was dealing with so many IT projects, so many of which were failing because organizations weren't following simple requirements like keeping documentation, doing proper accounting, right? Things that you would assume a company would do on their own, but they just weren't happening. So they created the Information Technology Industry Library, ITIL, and it defined how an IT operation should run, right? What should be done as far as how you process help desk tickets, how you monitor success, how you track SLAs, how you do accounting, all of that for IT. And what they did is they said, we're going to standardize this, and if you want to do business with the British government, you will follow ITIL. And if you don't follow ITIL, you can't do business with us. And that's it. It had teeth. Not like a best practice where it's up to you. A standard, there's times where you get penalized for not following it. Now, you might just choose to follow a standard because you know it'll help you and not actually have any penalty. We do that here at IT Pro TV all the time. There's a lot of standards that we follow just because we feel like it, because we know it's a good practice. But in the end, if we didn't follow that standard, we'd still be okay. But there's a lot of people out there that if they don't follow the standard, they actually get penalized, and that would be bad, right, for most people. Now, in the standards world, there's a couple of different organizations that are out there. The absolute biggest one, the one you're going to hear about the most, is the ISO, all right? And let me just bring their site up. So the ISO is basically the International Organization for Standardization. Now, I know what you're thinking, right? It's ISO, why is it iOS in the letters? And the reason is that their primary language is French. And if you were to translate that into French, then it would be ISO. That's where the acronym comes from. But these guys make a ton of standards. Ronnie, you've been in IT as long as I have. Mm-hmm. Have you ever encountered any ISO standards?
I've encountered, no, I don't remember any really right off the bat. Yeah, not that way.
Well, so that's what a lot of people think is, I've never bumped into an ISO standard. But the reality is you have,
right,
and you just don't know it, right? There's things like when you buy a CD, right? The file system used on a CD is ISO 9660, does that sound right? So ISO 9660, that's the standard they released that said if you want to put files on a CD, this is the format you have to use. And if I follow that standard, I know I can take that CD and put it in other people's computers and they'll be able to read the files. If I don't follow the standard, I could pop my CD in somebody else's computer and they can't read it, right? There's teeth to that one. I need to follow that standard. But they have ISO standards that cover all sorts of stuff. There's ISO 9000, which dictates how you should run a business. If you open up a business and you're really successful and you want to sell your business, if you are ISO 9000 certified, it shows that you've got a proper amount of documentation on how you did your finances, how you track your assets and inventory. And so when you go to sell the company, whoever's buying it knows they've got the right information. If you're not ISO 9000 certified, that's okay. You don't have to be. But now they're going to want to do a full audit because they can't trust that you kept the right documentation and paperwork, right? So that's an example of an ISO. There's tons of other ones. ISO 20000 is one that comes to mind. Back in the day when I first got ITIL certified, is it not? Oh, there we go. When I went to get ITIL certified, ITIL came out of England. And so here in the US, we didn't see a lot of that over here. And you do now. Now you see ITIL all over the place, but back then you didn't. And so anytime you search for it, you would normally find ITIL listed right by ISO 20000. And ISO 20000 is Information Technology and Service Management. It's related to ITIL, but now it's a standard that's designed to be more global. Now, ITIL is fine globally, like it is, but it was really designed by the UK government for needs that they had. ISO 20000 goes a little more global. The two are actually compatible too. So if you're using ITIL, you're probably using ISO 20000 also, and you just don't know it. We see it all the time. Half the electronics we use are branded with various ISO standards on them. The companies that we work for, it's really, really prevalent. And these guys make standards that a lot of governments and a lot of businesses follow and require. And so if you don't follow these, you can't do business with those organizations anymore. And that's a big deal. All right. So the ISO, they're the big one, right? They're the global one. They cover all sorts of different things, from running businesses to manufacturing to education, everything. They standardize so much stuff, it's insane, and it's a great resource. But there are specialized ones too, ones that are a little more focused, right? I talked about ISO and how it was global, and we talked about ITIL and how it was originally just for the UK. Well, speaking of the UK, we have, it's called the BS. Now, and in the United States, the acronym BS has multiple meanings, but for these guys, it's actually the British standards, right? So British standards or BS, they created standards just like the ISO, but for the UK, right? And so a lot of times you'll have a standard that will start out as a BS, and so it'll have, BS 2012 or something like that, right, as the number. And then they'll submit it to get it ratified with ISO, and so then it becomes a global standard. So you'll see some that have multiple names attached to them because they were ratified by more than one organization. But these guys here, they basically have all sorts of business improvement solutions and so on. I'm on their United States site, but it actually did come out of the UK. So if you jump in here and like flip over to the UK site, you'll see it's the same basic thing, but standards, training, testing, assessment, they've got all these different parts that are just kind of a part of that organization. And then notice under standards here, ISO 9001, ISO 14001, but then you've got BS 18001, right? That's one that hasn't been ratified as an ISO standard yet, but you can pretty much guarantee that that one's going to be moving through that process right now. So those are some examples of standards there also. And there's one more I want to watch. I know most of you watching this show are IT project managers. And in the IT world, there's one name that you're always going to hear, and that's the IEEE, right? The IEEE really focuses on electronics and IT, right? And their acronym is one that I always screw up. It's the I gotta cheat and use my notes here. The Institute of Electrical and Electronics Engineers. See, I screwed up and it's written on the paper in front of me. So the IEEE, we use their standards all the time. If you've watched any of our networking shows, we'll talk about wireless. And on a wireless network, if you go to the store to buy one, you'll see where they have 802.11a and 802.11b, G, N, AC, right? What the heck is all that? Well, the proper way to say it is IEEE 802.11b, IEEE 802.11ac. And what that is an IEEE, we'll call it a standard, 802.11, so 802 being the primary body, 11 being the subsection, and then AC, right, or B or G. Those are like the paragraphs, and you jump in and you find that data, and it explains how that wireless standard should work. And if you have two electronic wireless devices that are both certified for IEEE 802.11ac, they should be able to talk and be compatible, right? So IEEE, we see this one in electronics a lot. Key thing to remember, when the IEEE standardizes something, it'll oftentimes become an ISO standard, right? But while they're still working on it, they go through an RFC process. And we've talked about RFCs in other episodes, that's request for comment. They come up with a potential standard and they put it out there for feedback. And they say, let us know what you think. And as they get feedback back from their people, they start to update and adjust and try and create that final one. So when we run like 802.11ac wireless, it came out prior to that, right? What do they call that, Ronnie? When it comes out, it's I got preamble stuck in my head, but that's not right. It's
I don't know.
Shoot, it's got a name when it's a pre-standard, right? It's not
draft is what they I think
draft.
Yeah,
there
draft.
we go. So I'm preamble. I don't know why I'm thinking that, but draft. So they have you'll actually see people selling routers that are 802.11ac draft. Mm-hmm. Well, what they're doing is they're taking a risk. They're saying, we think our hardware will be able to handle it. It'll just be some little software changes. You can buy our equipment early. But it might change, and that hardware might not work anymore. I know when I was growing up, my father had a CB radio. And CB is community band here in the United States. The FCC was trying to figure out what frequencies they wanted to allow CB to run on. And at the time, there were some companies that hedged their bets. And they said, all right, well, we're going to support bands. I'm just going to make up some numbers here. It was like 1 through 13. And when the FCC finally settled on what was going to be allowed, it was 1 through 11. Well, my dad had bought one of these CB radios that was prior to that, and so he had 1 through 13. Now, What does that mean? Does it mean he has some super secret channels he can use? Well, no, it meant he had some channels that if he used, he could get in trouble, right? And we used to turn it on anyway. And you hear like tow truck drivers and private band that was assigned to those, and we weren't supposed to have them, but that's what happened because we didn't follow that standard. Whoever manufactured that equipment didn't follow, they didn't wait for the standard to be passed. So with the IEEE, you do have standards, but you also have RFCs. So you have like RFC 1918, which is one that dictates what's a private IP address versus a public IP address. And it can change if they want. They can add more to it because it's still an RFC. It's not set in stone, even though, when was RFC 1918 written? It was written like back in the early 1980s.
Had to be.
It's an old one, and it's still an RFC. That's kind of the funny part, is sometimes IEEE will let that sit out there. But it's just a great way to go out and find rules or regulations to follow that if you want your technology to be compatible with other people, you need to follow it. It's pretty important.
Yeah, so when we start taking a look at this, right, the idea of best practices and standards, well, they are essential to our processes that we're talking about, because sometimes we don't know exactly where to begin. Well, by actually saying, all right, for this particular project and what I'm going to be doing, finding the best practices is probably the easiest place. And then, of course, if you do live in a particular country, you may also have to follow those practices as well. So as project managers, being familiar with just both of them really do help us out when we start actually having to deal with these processes as well. So Don, are there any other things that we need to really worry about as far as the standards and best practices?
Not really. The ones that we've called out are the ones that PMI is specifically calling out on the exam objectives, so we want to make sure you're familiar with those, but there are other ones that are out there. Your industry may be different, right? We didn't talk about like medical or construction, for example, and there's different standards that you'll have for those guys. Fire code and so on, those all come into play, and you have like the NSTA for national safety, and so you get different ones that have all their own different standards or regulations that you need to follow. So just be aware of those so that you don't, when you go to build a process, you don't have to reinvent the wheel. You can go and look at these standards and follow them, even optionally. I might just choose to follow the standard so that I know I'm going to be compatible with other people, knowing that if I don't follow it, I'll still be okay, but it doesn't hurt to try and stay in line, because who knows, down the road, I might be required to do that, and it'd be better if I was already in that position.
All right, so in this episode, remember that what we actually took a look at is really the differences between best practices as well as standards, and we also mentioned some of the different standards organizations that you'll tend to see. The IEEE, the ISO, the BSI or BS British standards that were out there, and then also another one that really focuses in more on the process side, the CMMI.
Yep.
Those are also some of these places that you can go and check out those different standards and those best practices as well. So that's a great place for us to end this episode. Signing off for IT Pro TV, I'm Ronnie Wong.
And I'm Don Pizzette.
And we'll see you next time.